One of Mark's investors was the first to pick up the paper. I remember the exact sound it made sliding across the oak table. Soft, ordinary, like nothing important was happening at all. He read the first line, then the second. His eyebrows slowly lifted. Across from him, Taylor stopped chewing his roast chicken. Everline's glass of white wine paused halfway to her lips. And my husband, Mark Hayes, was staring straight at me like I'd just set the house on fire. "Carolyn," he said, his voice tight, "what the hell is this?" No one spoke. 13 people at that table. But suddenly the room felt silent enough to hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. I folded my napkin calmly. "Well, I said since everyone's here, I figured it was a good night to show the full numbers." You'd think the shock would come from shouting or accusations, but the truth is quieter than that. Truth just sits on the table and waits for people to read it. And that night, International Women's Day, truth was the loudest guest in the room. But to understand why I did it, you have to go back to the text message that morning. Because revenge doesn't start with anger. Sometimes it starts with one small sentence that makes you realize you've been invisible for 22 years. Part 1, the text message. My name is Carolyn Hayes. I'm 48 years old. I've lived in Cedar Rapids, Iowa my entire life except for 2 years at community college in Des Moines. Nothing dramatic about me. I like quiet mornings, black coffee, and the smell of fresh laundry. I keep a neat house. I balance my checkbook down to the penny. And until recently I was married to Mark Hayes, owner of Hayes Renovation and Design. If you asked people around town, they'd say Mark was successful. Friendly guy, big laugh, always shaking hands. What most people didn't know was that behind the scenes I handled nearly every detail of the business. Invoices, payroll, taxes, scheduling, the endless paperwork contractors hate dealing with. For 15 years I sat at the desk in the spare bedroom managing those numbers while Mark went out and collected praise. I didn't mind at first. Marriage is teamwork. Or at least that's what I believed. Things started changing maybe 3 or 4 years ago. Subtle at first. Mark began introducing the company like this. I built this business from nothing. Not we. Just I. The first time he said it at a barbecue with friends, I laughed it off. Later I noticed something else. When people asked if I worked, Mark would grin and say, "Carolyn's retired. She just keeps the house running." Everyone chuckled. I smiled politely. But inside I thought, retired from what I'm still doing, the books every night. Still, I didn't argue. Because that's the thing about long marriages. Sometimes you pick peace over pride. But peace has a way of wearing thin. That Wednesday morning started like any other. March 8th. Cold but bright outside. I was standing at the kitchen counter slicing apples for a pie crust when my phone buzzed. A text from Mark. I wiped my hands on a towel and opened it. "Cook dinner for 13 tonight?" No greeting. No explanation. Just that. Then another message followed. "Taylor likes apple pie. Everline loves roast chicken. Make it nice. She's bringing a friend." I stared at the screen. The word Everline lingered there like a stain. That name had been showing up a lot lately. I typed back the only thing Mark ever expected. "Okay." He replied with a thumbs-up emoji. That was it. No thanks. No Happy Women's Day. Just instructions. I set my phone down slowly. Outside, a truck passed on Maple Street, tires crunching the last bits of snow along the curb. The kitchen smelled sweet from the apples and cinnamon. For a long moment I stood there looking at the pie dough. And something inside me shifted. Not anger. Not yet. More like a quiet realization. The kind that arrives without warning and refuses to leave. Because that morning wasn't just another dinner. It was International Women's Day. And my husband had just assigned me catering duty for 13 people. I almost laughed. Instead, I poured another cup of coffee and sat down at the kitchen table. If you'd walked into the house right then, nothing would have looked unusual. Just a middle-aged woman reading a text message. But in my head I was replaying a different memory. 6 months earlier. At the bank. I'd gone in to deposit checks from 2 renovation projects. The teller, a young guy named Brian who always chatted about the Hawkeyes, pulled up the company account. Then he frowned. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, "which account did you want this in?" I blinked. "What do you mean?" He turned the monitor slightly so I could see. There were 2 business accounts listed. One I recognized. The other I didn't. Mark opened this one recently, Brian explained. You're not listed on it. That struck me as strange. Mark never handled the banking. Numbers made him nervous. But I said nothing. Just finished the deposit and drove home. That night after dinner, when Mark was in the shower, I logged into the company records. Sure enough, there it was. A new account, and a series of transfers I hadn't entered. Large ones. Several $1,000s each. Labeled consulting services. The payments went to someone named Everline Carter. I remember leaning back in my chair staring at the screen. At that moment I wasn't thinking about cheating. Just confusion. Maybe she was a designer or contractor Mark hired. But curiosity got the better of me. I opened the company email. Typed Everline in the search bar. The first message looked professional. A discussion about a renovation proposal. The second was friendlier. The third ended with, "Can't wait to see you tonight." My stomach tightened. I clicked another. Then another. Before long the tone was unmistakable. Flirtation. Jokes. Late-night messages. And one photo attachment that told me everything I needed to know. I sat there a long time that night. The house quiet. Mark humming in the kitchen, pouring himself a beer like nothing in the world was wrong. I didn't confront him. Not then. Instead, I printed a few emails, saved copies of the transfers, and tucked them into a folder, just in case. Back in the kitchen on Women's Day, I looked again at Mark's text. Everline loves roast chicken. Of course she did. He'd learned her favorite dish. After 22 years of marriage, Mark still couldn't remember how I liked my coffee, but he knew what she liked for dinner. I exhaled slowly. Then I stood up. If 13 people were coming for dinner, I had work to do. The grocery store was busy that afternoon. Hy-Vee on First Avenue always is. I filled a cart with ingredients. 2 whole chickens. Fresh green beans. Cream for mashed potatoes. Butter. Flour. Everything I'd need to make the meal perfect. Because if I was going to do this, I was going to do it right. Driving home, I noticed the sky turning pale blue, that sharp Iowa winter light stretching across parking lots and rooftops. The kind of evening where people think nothing unusual will happen. I carried the groceries inside. Set the chickens on the counter. Rolled up my sleeves. Cooking has always been calming for me. The rhythm of chopping. The smell of garlic and butter. It gives your mind room to think. And as I prepared that dinner, I started forming a plan. Not a dramatic one. Nothing reckless. Just something simple. Something honest. Something that would make sure everyone at that table saw the same picture I'd been looking at for months. By 3:30, the chickens were seasoned and ready for the oven. The pie crust was cooling in the fridge. I washed my hands, grabbed my purse, and drove downtown. There's a Staples near Collins Road where I sometimes print tax documents. I walked in with a flash drive and asked the clerk for help at the print station. 20 minutes later, I left with a neat stack of papers. Clear. Straightforward. Numbers anyone could understand. When I got back home, I set the pages on the dining room table. Right in the center. Not hidden. Not dramatic. Just there. Like a menu. Then I started setting plates. 13 of them. Forks. Glasses. Napkins folded neatly. The chickens roasted beautifully. Golden skin, crisp edges. The kitchen filled with that rich smell of garlic and thyme. By 6 o'clock, everything was ready. I changed into a simple navy sweater and brushed my hair. Nothing fancy. Just comfortable. The doorbell rang at 6:30. I took a deep breath and walked to answer it. Because the guests were arriving. And the truth was already waiting at the table. The first guest through the door was Taylor Jenkins. Taylor had been Mark's friend since high school. Tall guy, always smelled faintly like sawdust because he ran a cabinet shop across town. He stepped inside, stomping snow off his boots. "Carolyn," he said warmly, "something smells amazing in here." "Roast chicken," I said, taking his coat. "Mark told me it's your favorite." Taylor laughed. He's not wrong. He walked into the dining room and whistled when he saw the table. 13 people. You didn't have to go this big." I shrugged lightly. Mark asked. That was always the simplest explanation. A few minutes later, the doorbell rang again. Then again. Soon, the living room filled with winter coats, voices, and the low murmur of grown adults catching up after work. Two of Mark's renovation clients arrived: Gary Whitmore, who owned a chain of local auto shops, and Dennis Alvarez, a quiet man who ran a roofing company. Both had recently signed contracts with Mark. They shook my hand politely. "Mark's lucky," Gary said, "a home-cooked meal after a long day." I smiled the same way I had for years. "Yes," I said, "he is." Mark still hadn't arrived. Typical. When he hosted gatherings like this, he liked to show up last. Made him look busy. Important. By the time the next knock came, I already knew who it would be. I opened the door and saw Mark standing there brushing snow off his coat. Beside him stood a woman I'd only seen in photographs. Everline Carter. She was younger than I expected. Early 30s, maybe. Tall, dark hair, expensive wool coat that probably cost more than my entire winter wardrobe. And perfume. Strong enough that it floated into the hallway the moment the door opened. Mark grinned like nothing in the world was unusual. "Carolyn," he said casually, "this is Everline." Everline extended her hand politely. "Nice to finally meet you." Her voice was soft, friendly even. The kind of tone people use when they think they're entering someone else's house for the first time. I shook her hand. "Nice to meet you too." Mark stepped inside, already talking. Everline's been helping with some design ideas for the new Whitmore renovation project. Gary overheard that from the living room. "Good timing," he called. "We were just talking about that." Everline smiled and moved toward the others. Mark leaned close to me for a second. "Everything ready?" "Yes," I said calmly. He glanced toward the kitchen, smelling the chicken. "Perfect." Then he walked away to join his guests. Just like that. No thank you. No acknowledgement that I'd spent the entire day preparing the dinner he ordered. I watched him laughing with Taylor and Gary. For a moment a strange calm settled over me. Not sadness. More like clarity. Because when you finally see something clearly, the confusion disappears. And for months now I'd been slowly putting pieces together. It started with the financial records. Then the emails. Then the transfers. But there were other little details too. Things you only notice after 22 years of marriage. Mark started dressing differently. New shirts, sharper jackets, hair trimmed every 2 weeks instead of every 2 months. He began wearing cologne to work. The expensive kind. One evening last fall, he walked into the kitchen smelling like it had been poured straight from the bottle. I remember looking up from the laptop where I was reviewing contractor invoices. "Since when do you wear cologne to job sites?" I asked. He shrugged. "Clients expect professionalism." That was his answer for everything. Clients. Business. Networking. The strange part was that I believed him for a while. Because marriage teaches you to trust explanations even when they don't quite add up. But numbers don't lie. And bookkeeping has a way of revealing things people try to hide. The first transfer to Everline had been labeled consulting. $5,000. The second was $8,000. Then another. And another. I checked the project records. None of them listed Everline as a contractor. She wasn't on payroll. She wasn't on any official invoice. Just money moving quietly from the company account to hers. I told myself maybe she was doing design work. Interior consulting. That kind of thing. But the emails told a different story. One message from Mark said, "Dinner was perfect tonight." Another read, "Wish I could stay longer." There was even a photograph once, the two of them at a restaurant in Des Moines. Not touching, but close enough. Close enough that anyone married 22 years would recognize the look. That was the night I printed the first copies, not out of anger. Just preparation. Like keeping insurance documents in a drawer. You hope you'll never need them. But you keep them anyway. Back in the living room, the conversation had grown louder. Taylor was telling a story about a contractor who accidentally drilled through a water line in a bathroom remodel. Everyone laughed. Everline sat beside Mark on the couch, listening politely. Every once in a while, she glanced toward the dining room table. Maybe she noticed the stack of papers sitting there. Maybe she didn't. It didn't matter yet. Dinner was ready. I stepped into the room. "Food's on the table," I said. Chairs scraped across hardwood floors as everyone moved toward the dining room. The table looked beautiful. Simple but warm. White plates. Blue napkins. Steam rising from the roasted chicken. Mashed potatoes in a ceramic bowl. Green beans with almonds. And in the center of it, all the stack of printed pages. No envelopes. No labels. Just information. Taylor noticed them immediately. "What's this?" he asked, picking one up. I placed the apple pie near the window. "Oh," I said casually, "just some paperwork." Mark barely looked. He was too busy carving the chicken. "Let's eat first," he said, "business later." Everyone laughed again, and for a few minutes the evening felt like any other dinner party. Plates filled. Wine poured. Forks clinked against dishes. Gary complimented the seasoning. Dennis asked Taylor about a cabinet installation. Everline tasted the chicken and smiled politely. "This is really good," she said. "Thank you," I replied. Mark raised his glass. "To good friends and good business." Everyone echoed the toast. Glasses touched. Wine was sipped. But as people settled into their chairs, the papers on the table kept drawing curious glances. Numbers have a way of doing that, especially when they're sitting right next to your dinner plate. And sooner or later, someone was going to read them. I just didn't expect it to happen so quickly. Taylor unfolded one of the sheets while chewing a bite of chicken. His eyes moved down the page. Then he stopped chewing. "Mark," he said slowly, "what's this about unpaid contractor invoices?" The room went quiet. Mark looked up from his plate. "What?" Taylor turned the paper around. "Right here. Says several projects are overdue on payments." Gary reached for another copy. "Let me see that." Dennis grabbed one too. I took a sip of water and waited. Because once numbers start speaking, they don't stop easily. And the dinner party Mark planned to impress his friends was about to become something very different. Taylor kept staring at the page. Gary leaned closer to read over his shoulder. "Hold on," Gary said. "These numbers don't match what you showed us last month." Mark laughed nervously. "Guys, it's probably an old report or something. Carolyn prints tons of paperwork." He waved his hand like it didn't matter. Like it was nothing. But people who run businesses don't ignore numbers that easily. Gary picked up another sheet. Dennis had already grabbed one too. Their eyes moved slowly across the columns. Invoices, transfers, balances. Simple information. The kind any contractor or business owner understands immediately. Mark looked at me. The smile he'd been wearing all evening was gone. "Carolyn," he said quietly, "what exactly did you print?" His voice had that tone I'd heard before. The one he used when something slipped out of his control. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I reached for the bowl of green beans and passed it down the table. "Anyone want more?" No one did. Taylor cleared his throat. "Mark, this says there were payments to someone named Everline Carter." The room grew still. Every head slowly turned. Everline's fork froze above her plate. She glanced at Mark, then at the paper in Taylor's hand. I think there must be a mistake," she said softly. Mark pushed his chair back slightly. "This is ridiculous," he said. "Carolyn, where did you even get this?" That question almost made me smile. Because the truth was simple. I got it from the same place I'd been getting our financial information for 15 years. The bookkeeping system in the spare bedroom. But before I answered, my mind drifted back to earlier that afternoon. Back to the moment the plan really came together. After leaving Staples, I drove home slowly through the late afternoon traffic. Cedar Rapids isn't a big city. But around 4 o'clock, the roads get busy with people heading home from work. Minivans. Pickup trucks. School buses. Normal life. The kind of quiet routine you build a marriage inside. I parked in the driveway and sat there for a minute with the engine off. The printed pages were resting on the passenger seat. Nothing dramatic about them. Just numbers and a few short notes. But those numbers told a story. One Mark had been hiding. I carried them inside and spread them across the dining room table. The information was simple. A financial summary anyone could understand. 3 sections. First, overdue contractor invoices. Mark had delayed payments on several projects. Something that can ruin a reputation fast in the construction business. Second, transfers from the company account into Mark's personal account. Not illegal, but questionable when the company still owed money elsewhere. And third, the payments to Everline Carter. Listed clearly. Dates. Amounts. All labeled consulting services. Even though there were no consulting contracts attached. I stared at the pages. Part of me wondered if I should just hand them to Mark privately. Ask him to explain. Give him one last chance. But another memory surfaced. 2 months earlier. We'd been at dinner with friends from church. Someone asked how the business was doing. Mark leaned back proudly and said, "Better than ever. I've got investors lining up." Then he laughed and added, "And Carolyn doesn't have to worry about working anymore." Everyone smiled at me. I smiled back. But later that night I sat at my desk staring at the bank statements showing unpaid contractors and thousands of dollars leaving the company account. That was when I realized something. Mark wasn't just lying to other people. He was lying to me too. And if things kept going the way they were going, sooner or later those financial problems would land on my doorstep as well. Marriage ties everything together. Debt included. So that afternoon, standing in the dining room with the papers spread out, I made a decision. Not revenge. Not exactly. More like correction. Because Mark had spent years presenting a picture of success that wasn't entirely true. Tonight his clients and friends were coming to dinner. The same people he'd been impressing with stories about his growing business. And if they were sitting at my table, they deserved to see the same numbers I saw. I stacked the pages neatly, placed them in the center of the table. Then I went back into the kitchen and started cooking. Garlic and butter. Fresh thyme. Salt and pepper rubbed carefully into the chicken skin. The familiar rhythm helped steady my thoughts. Still, my hands shook a little when I checked the oven temperature. 22 years is a long time. Ending something that long never feels easy. At 5:30, I sat down at the kitchen desk and pulled out one more envelope. Inside were documents I'd prepared the week before. Divorce papers, along with copies of financial records showing my role in the company's bookkeeping since the beginning. I sealed the envelope and set it aside. That one wasn't for the dinner guests. That one was for Mark. Now sitting at the table with 12 other people watching, Mark's eyes were locked on me. "Carolyn," he said again, slower this time, "where did you get those numbers?" I finally met his gaze. "From the accounting system," I said calmly. Taylor spoke again. "This says the company owes almost $200,000 in contractor payments." Dennis nodded. "And these transfers, they're company money." Mark rubbed his forehead. "You guys are overreacting," he said. "It's just temporary cash flow stuff." Gary flipped to the second page. "Then why does it say you moved $80,000 into your personal account last quarter? No one touched their food anymore." Even the steam rising from the chicken seemed to fade. Everline was reading the page in front of her now. Her expression had changed. Not embarrassment. More like confusion. She looked at Mark. "Mark, what is this?" For the first time all evening, Mark didn't have a quick answer. He turned toward me. "This dinner was supposed to be about celebrating a few new contracts," he said. I nodded. "Yes." "And you thought this was the right time to drop financial reports on the table?" I folded my hands. My voice stayed steady. "Mark, I've been doing the books for 15 years. These are the same numbers I see every week." The room went silent again. Taylor slowly leaned back in his chair. "Well," he said quietly, "then I guess it's good we're seeing them too." Mark's face had gone pale. Because he finally understood something. The dinner party he'd organized to impress his friends was no longer under his control. And the evening was only halfway finished. For a few seconds, no one moved. You could hear the faint ticking of the clock above the kitchen doorway. 6:52 p.m. Funny the details your mind remembers when a room goes quiet like that? Taylor set his fork down first. Not loudly, just enough to make a soft clink against the plate. "Mark," he said, "I'm not trying to embarrass anybody here, but these numbers are pretty serious." Mark forced a laugh that sounded thin. "Taylor, come on, it's bookkeeping stuff. Carolyn loves spreadsheets." He glanced at me again, hoping I'd jump in and smooth things over the way I always had before. For years, that was my job. Make things comfortable. But tonight I didn't move. Gary Whitmore was already flipping through the pages. Gary wasn't the kind of man who skimmed financial details. He owned 3 auto shops and a tire warehouse outside Marion. He knew exactly how invoices and cash flow worked. He tapped one line with his finger. "This contractor payment from January, you told me that job was closed." Mark shifted in his seat. "It is." Gary shook his head. "Then why's it still listed unpaid?" Dennis Alvarez leaned closer to look. Dennis rarely spoke at gatherings, quiet guy, careful with money. But when he finally did say something, people listened. Mark, Dennis said slowly, "If these numbers are accurate, you're carrying a lot more debt than you told us." The word debt seemed to echo around the table. Across from me, Everline lowered the page she'd been reading. Her brow was furrowed now. "Mark," she said softly, "these transfers, they're from the company." Mark looked like he'd swallowed something sour. "They're reimbursements," he said quickly. "For what Gary asked." Mark opened his mouth. Closed it again. The silence stretched. I could feel everyone waiting. And suddenly the smell of the roast chicken felt almost out of place in the room. Warm and comforting while the air around the table had turned sharp. Taylor cleared his throat again. "Look, maybe we should talk about this after dinner." That was the moment Mark tried to stand up. "Yeah," he said quickly, grabbing his wine glass. "Exactly, this isn't the time." But Gary didn't move. Neither did Dennis. They kept reading. Because once people start looking at numbers that affect their money, dinner doesn't matter anymore. Gary lifted the second page. 80,000 moved to your personal account in November, he read aloud. Another 42,000 in December. He looked at Mark. "That's a lot of money to move while contractors are waiting to be paid." Mark's voice hardened. "Gary, you're blowing this out of proportion." Dennis pointed to another line. "And these consulting payments." He looked up. "Everline Carter." Every head slowly turned again. Everline froze. The color had drained from her face. I did some design consulting," she said. Her voice sounded smaller now. Mark jumped in quickly. "Exactly. She helped on a few projects." Taylor frowned. "For $50,000? Mark slammed his palm lightly on the table. "Consulting isn't cheap." The outburst echoed through the room. Then everyone looked at me. Because up until that point, I'd barely said anything. I reached for my water glass. Took a slow sip. Then I placed it back on the table carefully. "I should probably explain something," I said. My voice was calm, almost conversational. "I've handled the company bookkeeping since 2008. Gary nodded. "I know that." Dennis said quietly, "Same." I continued. "The numbers you're looking at are pulled directly from the accounting records." Mark leaned toward me, his jaw tight. "Carolyn!" But I kept going. "Most of the contractors listed there haven't been paid yet." I tapped the page gently. "And these transfers to Mark's personal account were recorded as owner withdrawals." Gary looked back at the sheet. Dennis let out a low whistle. Taylor rubbed the back of his neck. Mark's voice dropped. "You're making this sound worse than it is." I finally met his eyes. "Am I?" For a moment, neither of us spoke. 22 years of marriage sat between us like another guest at the table. Then Gary pushed his chair back a few inches. Not angrily. Just enough to create space. "Mark," he said, "we need to talk about this before moving forward on the new contracts." Dennis nodded slowly. "I agree." Taylor looked uncomfortable now. He'd known Mark the longest. But even he couldn't ignore the paperwork in front of him. "This isn't exactly what we expected tonight," he said quietly. Mark's face had gone red. He looked around the table like he was searching for an ally. Instead, he found 13 people staring at the same pages. Finally, his eyes landed back on me. "What exactly are you trying to do here?" he asked. The question hung in the air. I thought about it for a second. What was I trying to do? Embarrass him? Expose him? Hurt him the way I'd been hurt reading those emails? The truth was simpler than that. I folded my hands on the table. "I'm telling the truth," I said. No anger. No raised voice. Just a fact. And facts have a way of settling heavily in a room. Across the table, Everline slowly pushed her chair back. She looked from Mark to the papers again. "Mark," she said quietly, "you told me the company was doing really well." Mark opened his mouth again. But nothing came out. Gary stood up first. Not dramatically. Just a businessman recognizing a conversation that needed to happen somewhere else. "I think dinner's over," he said. Dennis followed. Taylor rubbed his face with both hands. "Well," he muttered, "this turned into one hell of a Wednesday." Chairs scraped. People stood. Coats were retrieved. No one touched the apple pie. Everline grabbed her purse without looking at anyone. Mark remained in his chair. staring at the papers, staring at me. And in that moment I realized something. For years, Mark had believed he controlled every room he walked into. But tonight, the room belonged to the truth. And the truth doesn't need to raise its voice to be heard. The front door closed behind Gary Whitmore first. Then Dennis. Then Taylor. Each goodbye was polite, quiet, and a little awkward the way adults behave when something uncomfortable has happened, but nobody wants to make it worse. No one blamed me. That surprised me more than anything. Gary paused in the hallway while putting on his coat. "Carolyn," he said gently, "thank you for the dinner." He hesitated a moment, then added, "and for the honesty." Dennis nodded in agreement as he pulled on his gloves. Taylor gave me a tired smile. Well, he said, I guess Women's Day turned out memorable. They stepped outside into the cold night air. The door shut. And just like that, the house became quiet again. Only 3 of us remained. Mark, Everline, and me. Everline stood near the dining room chair she had pushed back earlier. Her face looked pale now. The confidence she'd carried in when she arrived had disappeared somewhere between the first page and the last. She picked up her purse. "I think I should go," she said softly. Mark stood quickly. "Everline, wait." But she shook her head. Her eyes moved briefly toward me. There was something different in that look. Not hostility. Not embarrassment either. More like realization. Then she turned back to Mark. "You told me the business was thriving," she said quietly. Mark ran a hand through his hair. "It is," he insisted. "Carolyn's just exaggerating things." Everline didn't answer. She simply walked to the door. A moment later it closed behind her too. No slammed door. No drama. Just footsteps fading down the front porch steps. Mark and I were alone. For a long time neither of us spoke. The dining room still smelled like roasted chicken and thyme. Plates sat half-finished. Wine glasses untouched. A stack of financial summaries rested quietly in the middle of the table. Finally, Mark stood up. "What the hell was that?" he demanded. His voice was louder now, anger replacing the shock. "You embarrassed me in front of everyone." I remained seated. "You embarrassed yourself," I said calmly. His jaw tightened. "You've been going through my accounts." "Our accounts," I corrected. Mark laughed bitterly. "You couldn't have just talked to me." That question almost made me smile. For years I had tried talking. About late payments. About missing records. About how uncomfortable I felt seeing company money move around without explanation. Every time the answer had been the same. "Don't worry about it, Carolyn. I've got it handled." Handled. The word had been his favorite. I reached beside my chair and picked up the envelope I'd placed there earlier. Then I slid it across the table. "What's this?" Mark asked. "Open it." He tore the seal impatiently. The moment he saw the first page, his expression changed. "Divorce papers," he said. "Yes." He stared at me like I'd said something absurd. "You can't be serious." "I am." He flipped through the documents quickly. "What is all this?" he asked. "Financial documentation," I said. "Showing my role in the business." Mark's eyebrows pulled together as he scanned the pages. Hours of bookkeeping records. Bank authorizations. Emails. Proof that for 15 years I'd been managing nearly every financial part of Hayes Renovation and Design. "You're trying to take half the company," he said. "I'm claiming my share." He shook his head. "This is ridiculous." I leaned back slightly in my chair. "Is it?" Mark paced across the dining room. "You planned this whole thing." "No," I said quietly. "I planned to stop pretending." He stopped walking. "You think you're going to ruin me over some paperwork and a dinner party?" I looked around the room. The dishes. The half-eaten food. The quiet house that had once felt like the center of our marriage. "I didn't ruin anything tonight," I said. The numbers were already there. Mark stared at me. For the first time in years, he seemed unsure what to say. Finally, he grabbed his coat from the chair. "This isn't over," he muttered. "No," I agreed. "It's just finished." He left a few seconds later. The door shut, and the house became still again. I sat there for a while. Not crying. Not celebrating. Just breathing. 22 years of marriage had ended at a dinner table with 13 plates. And strangely, I felt lighter. Not happy. But steady. like someone who had finally stopped carrying something heavy. 3 months later, the divorce was finalized. The documents I'd collected mattered more than Mark expected. Turns out running a business together for 15 years counts for something. The settlement gave me a fair share. Not everything, but enough. Mark's company didn't collapse overnight. Real life isn't that dramatic. But he did lose a few clients. Word travels fast in small business circles, especially when money questions start circulating. As for Everline, I never saw her again. I heard through Taylor that she stopped working with Mark shortly after the dinner. Maybe she realized something that night too. These days I work part-time at a local accounting firm downtown. Quiet office. Good people. The kind who say thank you when someone balances the books correctly. Life feels different now. Quieter. Peaceful in a way I hadn't noticed missing before. Every year on March 8th I do something small for myself. Coffee with friends. Maybe a walk through Bever Park if the weather's decent. No big dinners. No cooking for 13 people. Just time spent with people who actually see you. And if there's one thing that evening taught me, it's this. Sometimes revenge isn't shouting. Sometimes it's simply placing the truth on the table and letting everyone see it for themselves. If this story reminded you of someone who finally chose her own dignity, maybe share it with them. And if you believe quiet strength still matters in this world, you're always welcome here. Thank you for listening.